how much of a primary axis of value and the feeling of goodness itself either is or ought to be dominated by the heart. And that, like, if you have from the beginning this reliable signal of how much of it is sort of serving as like an integrator into a common currency of organismic value grounded in one of the basic processes of life management, which can basically be coupled both within and even between individuals, and where the heart, it seems to on its own, certain forms of consciousness and awareness, be actually pegging events, like it's actually helping you to like tune in and be aware at the times where you're basically, it's tuning you into meaningful things. And so you're saying with all these ways, like maybe there is like this the talk of the heart as being foundational and fundamental to value as a guide. That might just make perfect sense cybernetically.
Perception paper recently, and the idea of it, and I had read, I don't know how much or if you've ever read anything by Dr. Damasio, the neuroscientist, and I had just finished his book Feeling and Knowing, where he kind of touches on this subject and separates feeling, knowing, conscious awareness from consciousness, and kind of makes it definitions more readily available, and separates this idea of interoception out and makes it a prominent point. And then I was reading over your paper on it and found just the idea of it interesting, and kind of wanted to get your idea on what that is, and if it's interoception in general, and what makes it different from introspection and metacognition, and how it fits into consciousness, kind of.
I'd love to talk about that.
Sure. Awesome. Well, that's what I wanted to get your perspective on, is kind of what it is, and how you see it fitting into phenomenal consciousness.
So should we dive in?
Sure. Yeah. Why not?
So interoception, it seems like it was for a very long time neglected, maybe because of its more inward-facing direction compared to other sensory modalities. Classically, we were really just thinking, we had the five senses, and that's just what everyone learned in school. But I mean, there's a sense of, I guess, in terms of things like interoception, I guess, like in Greek literature, like the way people would talk about it, like in the Iliad, talking about like thumos and people in their phrenes, it actually does sound like they had like a fairly rich language of inward directed perception. And so specifically this, rather than doing inference over your, let's say, your proprioception or your body's pose in space based on your joint angles, or exteroceptively, like what's on the other side of my body boundaries, what's am I seeing, out in the world as I'm visually or auditorily, interoceptively, what is my inner body doing? What's the viscera, the internal milieu of my body, all the different chemical processes, inflammatory states, my gut, my heart, my lungs, and all of these together as having a code for what class of situation this might be. Is this a place where a hunger situation, a thirst situation, an arousal situation? Am I over, like, how well am I doing relative to life management and homeostasis? And so interoception in that way has a lot of value, like what it is for something to be valuable. In a lot of ways, it gets represented as an interoceptive code, and that makes some sense developmentally. It's like you would start out with this basic this like kind of like a tree of valuing, where the roots would be in life management itself, and so then associatively you would learn, both just by statistical association and like through causal models of what it is that is connected to these primary values of what lets you be an organism. And then you're just building and aggregating complexity out of there, but the whole way through it's tethered to this fundamental imperative of how can I just be okay and healthy and good as a living being. Because if you don't have that, you have nothing. And so, of course, that's where the roots need to be of the tree of value. And so the whole way through interoception, these would be interoceptive roots, and that signature the whole way through of the different like affects or emotions, if you think of them as like different melodies. The song being played would be, I would say, not exclusively, but primarily an interoceptive one. So I think a good amount of affect, for instance, a good amount of emotion would be not just in inference over what my interoceptive state is. That should be one of the primary components of the melody in terms of establishing value, goodness or badness, because of the survival imperative. But some of it would be like based on things like, what is my body posture? What is my face doing? That's a lot of very rich, holistic, like organism agent level information of the overall mode you are in or ought to be in, and your stance relative to the world, and then also your stance itself. Like, what are my patterns of muscular tension? That's not necessarily interoceptive, although interoception will be richly cross-talking, both in like the mechanism and the phenomenology of it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to say that all emotion is interoceptive, even if it is very importantly, maybe predominantly. So those are some thoughts on interoception.
Yeah, absolutely. And like it kind of in your paper too is talking about it as a roadmap where we can kind of, it is an interesting phenomena how we kind of project. We have a map of our body in our minds, in our brains, from my understanding, and we can kind of project that map onto ourselves and kind of know if we have a pain in our leg, we know that's in our leg, basically because our brain has a map of our organism. And whenever we take that and we compare that to how we are feeling, it's kind of a meta level of thought, kind of sometimes, because if you have like anxiety or things like that, to where your inference about the world doesn't mesh with what is actually going on, then you get like an active inference type scenario, to where you go into a situation where you assume it to be a certain way, and you enter into that situation and it doesn't meet what your inference was. That active inference kind of seems to play a role into interoception, to where you're feeling a certain way or expect to feel a certain way, and you enter into a situation and that's not aligned with how you anticipated it to go. Then you have like an anxiety response and you project that onto yourself. Now you're anxious. So it seems like maybe there's a connection between this active inference creating anxiety, also mixed with our interoception kind of gone wrong, or inappropriately interpreting it. Would that be some kind of correct, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds actually, that's really beautifully expressed in terms of like within so within active inference, this ideas of more and more people are getting comfortable with the idea that perception is a kind of inference, but then this active inference idea is that your perception is being structured by your actions, not just in terms of the actions being part of the signal, but what generates the perceptions. The self-generated action usually actually being the primary source of your perceptions, unless you're like in a hurricane or something. But also, yeah, then otherwise, like, it's all the little motions you're doing.
Yeah.
But also like as a means of inference, and so the inference being the inference of you as a kind of both guess of the conditions of estimating what's happening with system and world, of what's likely to allow you to be to do the organism thing, what's allow you to be healthy, and inference though as a means of action, as a means of closing this gap between your expectations and reality. And so like you can think of like these emotions as like these body modifications going into something like an anxiety state, as you are actively changing the configuration you're in what you think will allow you to be a healthy adaptive organism. But you can get it wrong and get into loops with it, and that like the act of managing the situation could actually put you in the very circumstance that fuels itself. So it's like your attempts at managing the situation of threat, of uncertainty, could themselves be the primary source of it. And so some of, in terms of interoception, Sarah Garfinkel has really great work on this, where she'll show that people, so she'll break down your interoceptive introspection, this inspecting, inwards and feeling into it with heart sensations. She'll describe a breakdown of, I forget this, but it's sensitivity, sensibility, and accuracy, something like this. But the idea is like, well, how accurate are you? How calibrated are you in terms of like, do you know how accurate are you, and how responsive are you to these changes you're getting?
Yeah.
And so she's actually finding like people as their variation. Like, so let's say like you think you're very responsive, you think you're highly accurate, but you actually are off. This can be like a really powerful source of anxiety. Is this like irresolvable error with respect to your interoceptive states? And so then we can get into all sorts of richness in terms of like, well, what are the sources of why there might be a mismatch? Was it because like this is like you were actively trying not to feel at some point? It was too much, and you couldn't integrate it, you couldn't model it. Were you discouraged from it? Was this just not like, was your attention just pulled out of you? Like, it's just like a problem of modernity. All sorts of things like, sorts of really deep rabbit holes of whys that might happen. But then, so anyways, I'm with you.
And that's what you had mentioned about the circular nature that can become of evaluating your internal state versus what you expect your environment to be, and continually trying to prevent those mismatches can become in itself this cyclical process to where you're never really hitting it accurately. So you're always trying to adjust for these potential mismatches in your inference versus what your expectations are, and that mere act of adjusting to the potential of that itself is driving this perpetual anxiety. It's kind of what.
Oh man, tell me about it.
So see, and that was anecdotally kind of, it makes sense to me. I've been thinking about this particular thing, kind of you putting it into language makes it unique, because I've been thinking about this and I haven't been able to say it like that, I guess. But I think when I talked to you in the past too, I told you kind of adjusting from going into contemplative practice and psychedelics was an attempt to manage or find a way to learn myself better, to control these very phenomena better. I just didn't know I was trying to do that. I didn't know that was the source of it. I had this mismatch of what I expected my reality to be, and it continually wasn't that. And that was my perpetual result of that was anxiety. Well, coming out of like that situation that I had been in, where it was just a traumatic, abusive kind of relationship, going into future relationships, I started catching myself projecting that reality and assuming that reality to be present everywhere. So then even on my roommates and things like that, I began, even though I'd known these people for a long time, I was like, oh, well, these people are doing the same. My inference is people are always going to be, I'm in a heightened state of anxiety because I never know when somebody is going to continually just randomly flip the way they act towards me in such a way that, so I started to almost create a reality that wasn't there just because of stored up notions of almost, I guess, like kind of traumatic, post-traumatic kind of situation, to where you assume it to be everybody to have that same personality that I had kind of put onto me. So you're trying to adjust to a reality now that everybody's not that way, but you're assuming they should be, or they will be, or even in new relationships, you go into it and you're already saying, well, my inference should be, I should be on the expectation that this could go completely south, or that this relationship will not develop properly. So go ahead and adjust to that inference. That way, in case it does, and that cycle, that kind of sounds like what you were talking about, kind of a cyclical, to where you're perpetuating your own anxiety on accident because of your expectations of what could produce anxiety.
I mean, it's like, it's like, our weakness is our strength, and our strength is our weakness. It's like it's a good thing that you can draw that yesterday's posteriors are today's and tomorrow's priors. Like, it's how else could you be prepared for things? But then, like, if you have like a really bad experience, like some sort of like outlier event, it can really anchor you into a different framing of things. But you have no choice but to rely on these models because it's your only grip, your only purchase on anything. But then if these highly salient events that happen to you, salient, yeah, that's one way of putting it, that will set a powerful expectation that both like one of the worst things about it is not only might you stop realizing that or find it difficult to imagine something better is possible because of these expectations that could motivate you to actually change your situation, but that actually you can set up self-realizing expectations, like self-fulfilling prophecies, if you're expecting things. I mean, because it's kind of like prisoner's dilemma. Like it shows up like in myth too, like or was it Orpheus and Eurydice, or like Lot and his wife, and like these like leaps of faith, or like Isaac, and it's this like this important of like trust, and it's like you can't, and it's like you have to be somewhat it's like to be trusting and trustworthy so that you're on the right side of the game theoretic equilibrium, so you don't defect, so that people bring out the better angels of their natures with each other. Like on the wrong side of that, if you have a really bad relationship experience, and it can take some time to like basically rebuild the openness and courage to, create that positive sum, that like, beautiful synergy that is possible in love.
Yeah, no, that exactly. Yeah, and those are good comparisons in myth, especially. And also, like, not using that, not trying to make that the focal point of it or anything, but it is interesting to human consciousness and interoception that it can become your own worst enemy in a certain way if you're overanalyzing it, or if you allow the past to predicate the future too much, then you create those self-fulfilling prophecies in a certain kind of way. But I have noticed. What's that?
Not that I've ever done that or that's ever happened to me.
Oh yeah, of course not. Me either. I'm just making this but yeah, definitely.
Think of argument. Yeah.
But it is interesting. Like I've seen I've been able to slowly see improvements in that through contemplative practice, or through having psychedelic experiences and things like that. It has been interesting, is because it puts you into a state of heightened ability to interocept, almost, if you're able to get into those states and analyze yourself versus your environment, and self versus other. It's almost like learning about consciousness as a person like myself from a non-academic background can help you try to fit into these scenarios better. That way you're not just the victim of anxiety and you have no clue of its source. So I think going into deep contemplative states, or meditation states, or even psychedelic states, if you're doing them in a manner that's, it can really help you see that when that situation comes about, you can be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what this is caused by. I know that I'm projecting onto the situation something from the past, and that way now I can actually notice the moment that anxiety begins, because I can be like, oh, because I had this map of my environment, and I've already, in this right now, I'm creating anxiety out of nothing. I'm creating it because, and then you can notice that point in which that starts, and notice like it almost, the inference of what you expect and your past experiences collide with each other, creating anxiety. And that exact moment of collision between your template and what's real hits, and then you realize, oh, I actually can feel the physiological increase in my heart rate, of my dissonance in my head, where I'm separating myself from the situation even though I'm directly in it. And that, as a result, is creating anxiety. And then you can kind of interrupt it, or at least understanding how that anxiety starts and why it's starting is. But I guess you're forced to kind of face that moment and realize that. And psychedelics seem to be able to, and contemplative states seem to be able to make you comfortable with your own faults in a certain way, to where you can actually allow yourself to admit, this is my fault. I'm creating this perpetual cycle of anxiety. And then you can interocept your feelings in a way and project them back onto yourself in a way that over time you can catch these situations. But there's something to be said probably about not being on edge, but using a model that, does prevent you from having the same situation happen again. You definitely probably want to put steps in place to catch. It could be a good thing that you're having those experiences, but it's hard. It's a good thing through contemplative practice. I think as a whole, you start to realize what self is and versus other in such a way that you can notice these situations arise quicker and separate it out, and kind of catch on quicker to what you're causing for no reason, kind of, and what's actually reality. It seems like to me that contemplative practice allows you to face your own problems a little bit easier in regard to what you're generating and projecting versus what's really happening.
Seems like it's expanding your free will in those ways. And it's like it's giving you this greater, like, degrees of meaningful choice with respect to the experience. Because like if you know, if you're completely fused with the situation and are just don't have in mind that there's a process that you can then observe and be like, oh wait, I have different, like, you know, do I you could take different perspectives on it, you know, move between different construals, and as opposed to just being like this, like positive feedback loop into an attractor of like the experience becomes more vivid, it becomes more compelling to you, you believe it more, it becomes more vivid, and then pretty soon it's like that's reality. And then you don't have that, you have less of that space between stimulus and response. You have less available moves in terms of like what kind of situation could this be? Like,
Exactly.
the thing I'm and some of the centering prayer, like,
Oh yeah.
I explored some of it, and I found it really interesting how her emphasis, I forget her name, the scholar, it was like,
Oh yeah. The lady that had sent you that video on.
yes,
Oh,
yeah.
oh yeah, Reverend. I forget her name too.
I forget the reference name, but she was teaching Keating's centering prayer.
Yes.
She was talking about like seeing through the eyes of the heart.
Yes, yeah.
And that seems like that might be a powerful thing that's a part of it. I was wondering, like, if you could tell me some more about like whether that's like part of your practice and what like that's like.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that unique too. She that was one of the more analytic. That was one of the better comparative religious speeches on considering prayer that she had done too. She had compared it kind of to the Buddhist practices and things like that, but especially the notion, the seeing through the eyes of the heart. I had been looking into that phenomena of the heart mind, the heart brain becoming synchronized in a way where you're thinking, where it almost feels like you're utilizing more of something other than your head as the center of your being, and putting more of yourself into the heart, and looking into the neurological aspects of that. And it seemed like there was actually, some science on this idea that there's a large amount of neuronal activity in the heart that is synchronized with the brain, and that those becoming kind of mesh together, there being a more synchronous relationship between the heart and mind, is actually a phenomenon you can definitely induce through contemplative prayer, contemplative practice. You can actually create a more subtle and synchronized pattern that where you're actually feeling with your intuition that comes from the heart more, and not just saying from the heart like to as a euphemism or anything, but actually truly there's cognition that can occur in the heart, which I found kind of interesting.
And she was saying like, yeah, she was like, no, this is move your attention to your heart, attend to your heart. And like,
yeah, exactly. And I've been trying to do that so much more so recently with my centering prayer, and everything that I was doing was trying to utilize the heart as almost, there's this contemplative practice that I used to follow, and it was called the Headless Way. And it was a practice where you try, yes, yeah, Richard Lang, I believe, isn't it? And I was really enjoyed that. I got his book, and I really went through that for a long time, and really found it unique. And I started pairing that Headless Way kind of approach to this with the heartfulness aspect of centering prayer, and was able to really induce a pretty tranquil, very nice state, to where you almost feel like you're in your heart, to where you drop the center of cognition into the heart somehow. And that, coupling that with like the Headless Way practice, seemed like to me to really help get the centering prayer more centered, and not so much loss of the self, but centering the self in the heart, in a contemplative prayer fashion, has been a really beneficial practice to me. Because before, the Headless Way was a really unique practice. However, coupling it with this, I found a really nice sweet spot, so to speak, of contemplation.
I imagine that would be powerful. Like I've never gone as deep into like either of those as I want, but like I do notice like I've tried some Headless Way and so some when I was able to work with me well, I noticed like it was a feeling of like my shoulders relaxed and my chest felt easier. And so
Yeah.
like I can see like if I was practicing more when I was doing that, like a heart awareness, it would be easier to tune in. Like it
Yes.
just naturally caused like heart opening or chest opening. And like
Yes.
the so I guess a few things that are coming to mind that you might appreciate. So like um so also related to some of Sarah Garfinkel's work on heart awareness is she's finding that we're better able to detect emotional events when they come in phase with the left ventricular, the strong left ventricular contraction. It seems we don't know completely all the mechanisms. It's probably like redundant in terms of like multiple ways this is like shaping the system.
Yeah.
And that makes some sense in terms of like just how fundamental it is like for life management. You that if it is there at the base, at the ground floor of the tree of mind growing, that it will come back in multiple ways, and also that you would want it to be like robust, its effects.
Yeah.
Because if your heart's not beating, it's not going to, things aren't going to go very well for you. And so you seem to have this like rich, like intelligence of the heart on its own, and it's like its local ganglia, its own brain as an active inference system, so that it can basically learn to not just be reactive, but slightly, but proactive enough, even if it's something as basic as something like I think what we call like impotence matching, like making sure that like it can adjust so that you don't get like wrong, difficult, chaotic dynamics where it's like pushing at the wrong time. But I think it's richer than that. And there's work with neurovisceral integration. There's an interesting, like, which you might have encountered, but it's this crosstalk, that rich crosstalk between like your awareness of what's happening and the cardiac dynamics themselves, where it's like your own arousal, and it can happen in multiple ways. Some of them are more base physiological, like for instance, like as you breathe, a good amount of like your heart rate variability seems to be just as you breathe in, it seems that you get an acceleration, and then as you breathe out, you get a deceleration of the heart rate. And just that coupling of like the breath and the speed is one aspect. And there's actually some interesting meditations that try to like use that. Oh, sorry.
You're fine.
Okay. But then the other ones are like, so as your heart rate is changing though, you then are subjectively aware of this. But then your changes in awareness feed back into your heart and are changing this. And so it's this like really nonlinear rich crosstalk that can happen as you're as you're becoming aware of the changes, which causes changes, which changes your awareness of them. And so this neurovisceral integration, this heart rate variability, this ability to like be, well, it seems like there's multiple things contributing to coupling between the central nervous system and the heart dynamics. It seems that across them, when the heart is more variable, it's associated with like being in a more relaxed, positive state. Like it's like more exploratory dynamics, or maybe you could say more playful like dynamics in your heart. And that's like you being copacetic. This is where you ought to be. And this would also make sense from an active inference perspective, because there is this sort of like playful exploratory part that's required. You're not just like, ruthlessly hitting a set point. You're also, that's your gradient flows. It's also the solenoidal parts where you're just sort of like, where you have like, where you can slide around differently, just trying out different things. And so this seems to be, I've been wondering, like, to what extent the way in which, how much of a primary axis of value and the feeling of goodness itself either is or ought to be dominated by the heart. And that like, if you have from the beginning this reliable signal of like how much of it is sort of serving as like an integrator into a common currency of organismic value, grounded in one of the basic processes of life management, which can basically be coupled both within and even between individuals, and where the heart, it seems to, on its own, certain forms of consciousness and awareness, be actually pegging events. Like, it's actually helping you to like tune in and be aware at the times where you're basically, it's tuning you into meaningful things. And so you're seeing all these ways, like maybe there is like this the talk of the heart as being foundational and fundamental to value as a guide. That might just make perfect sense cybernetically. That might just be like how it ought to be.
Well, that was like the best way I've heard. Well, yeah, because you hear so much about or not so much really, but it's not the correct thing, not so much, but you hear a lot of talk about the heart and kind of its esotericism of it. The heart should speak to the mind and things. That's the most symphonic way I've heard somebody connect it with language to what this process of cognition and being is. The way you said that, it's almost like if you've got multiple instruments in an orchestra, and but you still have a key of C, or you play, I don't know much about music theory, but I know that you might play a symphony number 5 of Beethoven in the key of C. Well, all of those instruments are playing different tones, but they're all playing in the tone of C. Well, the conductor's kind of keeping that C major, the primary underlying tone of the whole orchestra. And so it seems like maybe, yeah, the way you described it there, it's like, there still needs to be this conductor of all of these signals that are, you're acting in the world with action, you're moving your appendages, you're going towards your homeostatic desires, but you're also trying to manage when you can get those versus what you need to do. So you have the brain creating all of these inferences, but the heart's grounded, kind of what you're saying, it's grounding all that back into this baseline frequency of being where it's got it has the intuition necessary, it has the active inference aspect of it, and this cognition can at least rest back in the heart. No matter how wild and how many wheels are spinning in the mind, the heart seems to, like you said, it's always beating. It's always beating, but being able to return to a center of heartfulness in a way, amongst how much ever directions you're going with different thoughts and ideas, the heart, you could find that center of solace there.
Centering and resting in, and returning home to it's like returning home to the tonic. It's also it's like this is where you ought to be in a way. It's like ultimately the organism should be in a place with, maybe like in a temporary state of distress, you want to reduce the variability of heart dynamics so you can have like maybe some sort of like fine-grained control, or maybe be like hyper still, or in some way that like I don't know, a predator, like maybe even like some predators could like notice like certain heart dynamics. I don't know all the reasons you would want to like lock down the variability, or it's just like maybe a good portion of variability is the awareness. And as you go more externally oriented, almost exclusively, you lose some of the crosstalk. I don't think we know all the sources of it, but this kind of, though, where you ought to be is with a relaxed and playful heart, ultimately, that can basically explore and learn how to couple in different ways, both with you and with others. And that basically this sort of like entanglement between like mind and body, between mind and mind, between body and body, that one of the like most important conduits could be related to these interoceptive signals. I find to be very compelling. Like that, like we're all bound by organismic value. And we're all here in this project of like first just basic life management, but then trying to I'll work with one of my collaborators, animals, called like Co-Homeostasis, where it's like from the beginning. She has some really good work. We wrote this one paper, Back to Square One, about like potential origins of consciousness developmentally, but she has this other paper called I think The First Prior, Embodiment and Co-Homeostasis. And so she's talking about this basically initial situation where we're starting out with one organism inside another organism, completely dependent in every way for life management, and this basically a kind of co-agency, and that taking seriously, like, this is where we start. But this co-agency, like the primary thing of it though, is starting out, it's very biological, and it has to be. It's very like just, the infant gets hungry, it gets cold, you cradle it, you rock it, you are helping it manage its autonomic states. That's the primary thing we're doing from the beginning. And it's like we take these basics of life and science just to complain, and it's like because they're basic, we don't think they're fast. We lose track of them. We don't think like the universal, the foundations of what allows there to really be any meanings whatsoever kind of ends up getting neglected almost. Like it ends up, it's like the very thing that we should be trying to explain the most, which is the most fundamental, the most universal, sometimes ends up seeming to be like uninteresting or unserious in some way. And I feel like the heart and like thinking in terms of like these early experiences, like what is it like to come into the world as an infant, somehow along the way got disrespected by science. And I don't think that's been good for us.
Wow, it's very interesting. Yeah, and I find something funny anecdotally. Recently, my sister had three infants, triplets. And you said that about the heart. I just wanted to share just because it reminds me. I was visiting with them, and she couldn't get him to stop crying. My grandmother was like, "Oh, it's always super important to take the infant, bring him next to your heartbeat." And my grandmother has the magic touch for the babies in the family, where she can hold them and they stop crying. But it reminded me just of that small little story of my sister was asking grandma kind of like, "How do you get them to stop crying so quick?" And she's like, "Well, don't you know?" She's like, "You just put them right next to your heart and let them synchronize with your heart." But it's funny being from, she's not but it's funny to see my grandmother, what you're saying. And she could, you could give her a baby that was just fussing, crying, and it would stop. But she was always talking about how, oh yeah, you put it next to your heart and it feels the heart and it gets on the same heartbeat. She doesn't know that for sure, but that's what she would say.
I wouldn't be surprised if it does, because if you like think of like, I'm personally like, I tend to be a little bit more conservative of like boundaries for certain types of consciousness, but we don't know exactly when what forms of awareness first are there. But if you think of just like what are the sources of order, what are the sources of stability, what are the primary signals, like even just auditorily, if you're inside another person and they're a lot bigger than you and their heart isn't too far from your head, and their heart, you're actually sharing, you have co-interoception. A lot of compounds can go right across that placenta. I believe cortisol can, so you might actually have not only entrainment between cardiac signals and this is basically helping to tune up your auditory system in a powerful way, but this might actually be also coupled to your own interoception, maybe even your own olfaction, in terms of you can smell also the chemicals that infuse into your mother. It's been shown not only, for instance, our infants learning enough that, or not only our fetuses learning enough that when they're infants, they're already familiar, they're showing sensitivities to like the phonemes and the morphemes of their native tongue, but also their native cuisine. So the smells are going through also. So you have this affective bridge to someone else, and you can hear, the primary thing maybe you can hear is their heart. I don't know like how far that goes, but I could see that going a long ways. And so I would not be at all surprised if what you described is actually like a pretty good hack, which is you bring them home. And I wonder, like in terms of like a lot of spiritual language, like centering, coming home, being still, how much of this is the language of basically, if things have gone right, the first lessons that we have in our learning curriculum as intelligent agents are primarily of this embodied and also from the beginning in a way intersubjective, even if it's not fully like self and other, but like from the beginning a kind of mutuality and interdependence, that basically a lot of what feels like of what we mean when we say something is valuable, when something is meaningful, and the ways in which, like, at the height of meaning and value of spirituality, the ways we conceive of it, whether there is a kind of origin story that is of this kind, that we I don't know if I'm making sense, but like.
No, you're absolutely.
We just froze. Mm. You're frozen. Mm. Let's see. Mm. You're back. I hear you. Hello? Hello? Might resolve itself.
Am I back, or can you?
You're back. I hear you.
Okay. All right.
So
Okay. Huh.
what's the last thing? So I think
Okay.
the last, oh, now I see you. And the last thing I heard, so I was wondering whether there's a deep connection between religious intuitions and the ways in which we come into the world. And then
Yeah.
I was questioning whether that made sense. And then you said,
Yes.
no, you think it does. And that's where we left off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. No, I do. I think when I was thinking about this centering prayer and the heartfulness idea recently, I started looking to the Bible specifically for a text, ancient text basis on religion, and it's really interesting because it's 2 or 3 times in the Bible. It's just the Lord, in this case, in the Psalm he says, write these things on the tablet of your heart, for the heart knows best. I really like the analogy of writing it on, etching something onto the tablet of your heart, meaning like your deepest intuitions. If you have an anxiety about a decision to make, or about a road to take, and a left and a right and a fork in the road, it says to trust what's been written on the tablet of your heart in these difficult, traumatic times, or tumultuous times, to always end. And also, of course, there's a verse that I look at, like I keep on my list of verses. That's a proverb that says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Now, I think there's something specifically unique about that. It's not just the typical your heart. That I think it means something truly. And there's tons of references to the heart in the Bible in pretty profound ways. And it says the world knows of you by your doings and your actions, but the Lord knows of you by what's in your heart. It's multiple times. There's a clear delineation made in the Bible between your actions and the heart being why you're doing something. And so it would say, like Jesus would say in the New Testament, he would say, well, if you're praying out in front of all the people and you're fasting to make it look like you're fasting, and you're doing it for the glory of yourself, so other people know you're fasting, so they think you're godly. He says, well, the Lord searches your heart, not your doings. He's like, so if you're fasting to make everybody around you know that you're a godly man, and you're doing it for that outward appearance, then the Lord doesn't care, because he knows your heart. He knows why you're doing it. So if you're doing it for gratification from the religious elite, well, the Lord's not going to see that favorably, because he knows what's written on your heart. So he basically, the Bible kind of routinely goes back to the heart as God, and whomever knows the motivations, and all your motivations originate in the heart. So if you're doing something virtuous, but you're doing it so you can brag about it, well, the Lord knows that. So you're not going to get away with pretending to be virtuous, because the Lord knows your actions originate in the heart, and all your actions are written and etched in the tablet of your heart over time. And so I think it's kind of a unique perspective.
So they're acknowledging or highlighting connection between mind and heart as a source of both like deep memory and motivation and discernment, where it's a kind of like so you can, like, for instance, like have maybe something more exteroceptively and proprioceptively dominated of like an instrumental sort of things in the world that's like the focus of your attention and consciousness, and you're like looking away from your own heart and just thinking of like getting something done, and on that level you might have like a nice story of what you're doing, of some sort of action, and you might have a nice cover story. But unless there's like this crosstalk of kind of like a coming back, tuning in, and what's that actually it's not, it may not be as integrated into you, it may not be as robust, and it may also not even be just not robust, like it could be like a confabulation, like you're following one motive, but then actually you're just like selecting a cover story to communicate about it, maybe even to yourself. And so you can get into all sorts of like
loops,
difficult situations.
Yes, and it's talked about in Greek literature too, and like
if I'm understanding, that's
Yes, you're absolutely understanding it right. Yeah, and I think that I think that that's what the Bible's trying to say, is that if your motivations are externally seeking, so I mean, this is a very rudimentary example and not a good one, but if you're giving homeless people food, but you're doing it so your friend in the car sees you do it, so that you get some extra incentive for that from your friend, or you're going to give money to somebody and then go tell the world about it. Well, the Bible specifically has a teaching against doing anything like that. If you're doing something externally, if you're giving money to the poor, it should be done in private. You shouldn't be doing it in front of a bunch of people. You shouldn't be seeking the treasures of the world from doing something virtuous. You shouldn't be, because like Jesus said, he says, what you have done to the least of my people, you have done unto me. And what he means by that is the poor and all that, you should be helping them. That's number one on the list. I mean, there's like Saint Teresa, in the Catholic tradition, she gave her entire life to the poor, and she had this saying that was written on there. It said, you did this unto me. And she reminded herself, because Christ was saying, whatever you do unto the least of these people of this world, you have done to me, and whatever you do badly towards them, you've done unto me. And so that idea of that kind of is that Christ was saying that, you shouldn't be doing the heart tells the story, and the Lord knows your heart. So if your virtue is being enacted out of a simple reward or self-seeking hierarchy in the world, then that's not true virtue. That's not the true expression of virtue that we should be seeking. We should be seeking, helping others for the sake of willing their good. Like the idea of love to me in the Christian tradition kind of centers around the definition, not of like some romantic tension or romantic connection, but of truly willing. It's like an act of will. A bishop that I listen to frequently uses this definition a lot, and he says that love is actively an act of the will. He said it's an act of the will to will the good of other. So like if you're actively willing the good of other, that is a practice of love, and that cultivation of that will build on itself. So your heart will become more loving as you truly will the good of other, not for yourself or for the sake of you getting a built up from it, but truly actively, participatorily willing the good of other in the smallest of ways. That is like a slippery slope to just abundance of love coming into your life. And I think that's true to that. I think that the will, like we talk about free will and all that, but willing the active good of another and really wanting that for them is what the heart knows. The heart gets into that. The heart feels into that. And so I think for certain that even in Plato's, the Symposium, they talk about the origin of virtue, and they're trying to have these dialogues, Plato and Socrates, about virtue. Where does it come from? Can it be taught? And Socrates is basically saying, no, you can't teach virtue. He's like, I think the analogy they use is teacher to student. You can't teach empathy. You can't teach it in the classroom. And we've still trying to, there's like classes nowadays where these professors are looking into, can you teach empathy? Is there a way to increase empathy? And it's such a weird phenomenon of virtue, what it is. Why would there be this altruistic thing if we were biologically just trying to survive out of the fittest and try to will only the good of ourselves? How evolutionarily would we ever prioritize self or other over self if it was simply to reproduce and that's it? There's got to be some origin of virtue. And the way the Bible, and it says that it's the fruit of the Spirit, all virtue, peace, gentleness, kindness, self-control, temperance, all those things. It's from the Spirit is what the Bible says. It says all the virtues, and it lists all 9 of them. And for the longest time, I was looking into where does virtue come from? Primarily looking into Greek dialogues, and they couldn't ever figure it out. And then I get to the Bible, and I'm reading it, and then I'm looking at it, and then it says, oh, well, the fruits of the Spirit are peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, self-control, and all these things. And I'm like, oh, those are the virtues. Oh, I was like, if the Bible is true, then the Bible specifically saying these come from the Spirit and they lie in the heart. And so I was like, that's an interesting phenomena, is that you're looking for all these origins of virtue and nobody really knows. But then you read the ancient text of the Bible, and he's like, oh, well, the Spirit, that what imbues your body with consciousness, that is what actively permeates virtue into the body, and virtue builds upon itself by enacting the will of the good of others.
Permeates virtue into the body.
That's a weird thing to say. Yeah,
It's a profound thing to say.
I think that's true. I think that it imbues the body with it through the conscious will of Spirit. Yeah.
So there's a couple things that may land to different degrees. Although, one thing along those lines is I have some models I've proposed where interoception because of the relatively diffuse spatial and temporal character of the phenomena, they tend not to be as localized, and they tend not to be taken up into action perception cycles that achieve like rapid closure of a kind where they would tend to be like pump, pump, pump. So like you tend to get things like referral. So the same way that like smell gets like basically, I would say synesthetically like infused into taste, where like you experience the phenomenology of smell, a lot of it in the mouth, localized to the tongue, that interoception will get localized into proprioceptive and exteroceptive modalities, getting infused into them. So I wonder how much of the phenomenology of will, of just like being a person, is actually this kind of interoceptive synesthetic infusion, where it's basically your inner body, your value signals are conjoined with your moment-to-moment perception of your body, its affordances, its inactions, and it's like that you have these couplings, these contingencies of willing, feelings of urge and acting, and that actually it's of that kind. But now, let's say we're talking about this though, not just of any motivated behavior, but of virtue, of like the desire, like the willingness, like love in action. And so it like actually like infusing your body. Like that seems like that feeling of like, that's what I want. It's like, I want to go through the world where there's like a feeling of heart connectedness infusing my body, where my actions are filled with love. That sounds like a very successful organism in an okay life, I think, if I could pull.
I think so too.
Like
I think so too. I want that too. Yeah, I think that's what I was. Yeah, I think that point's interesting too, because I was just listening to somebody break down an aspect of the Bible specifically again, but it was talking about this idea of the will and how when we act. This gentleman was breaking down this structure of the Bible in an Orthodox tradition, and he was explaining it from his customs, and the way he viewed this phenomena was basically what I said, this idea of imbuing the body with virtue, but imbuing the mind with the conscious awareness of willing the good of other, builds upon itself automaticity in actions that you do. So you think, oh, well, I need to follow these set of ancient laws. That's what we think about when we see ancient texts. We're like, okay, well, we need a moral law we've got to follow, and there's a punishment and a reward for doing one or the other. And this gentleman was more or less breaking that down to, once you have acted with virtue, the Bible teaches that once your heart is acting upon the good of other over self, and it's that yourself is dying on the cross with Christ, essentially, the lower self, the ego, dies on the cross, and Christ demands his followers to pick up their cross and to follow him. That's an ancient way to me of Christ saying ego death. He's saying, pick up your cross and follow me, and drag. And I always in my head look at that as Christ had to carry his own cross, this giant wooden cross, all this way, and then he had to be nailed to it physically. I mean, that's just horrible. I mean, that's a lot of pain. But what Christ is saying, is pick up your cross. I mean, this guy, in the Christian tradition, is the embodiment of God on earth and the divinity walking around, and he had to be nailed to a tree, and he picked up his own cross and carried it, and then allowed himself to be nailed to it. And so to hear the phrase of Christ saying, pick up your cross and follow him, well, that's a heavy duty task to ask somebody if you're going to believe in that tradition. I mean, yeah, that means pick up all the suffering, all the stuff you've been through, the future suffering, all that, pick it up and imagine dragging it like a cross that's super heavy. And then at the end of it, you're going to die. Everybody's going to die. So your whole life, you're picking up all this suffering and you're shouldering it.
You mean the situation we're in?
Yeah, the inevitable suffering that permeates the whole
reality, what you just described. Like
exactly. And so I think the Buddhist tradition kind of has a more an angle at it, where we need to sufferings everywhere, and we need to avoid it and retreat into it, dissolve the self. And then when the self doesn't exist, then we can't suffer anymore, and we can meditate 20 hours a day, which is fine. But the Christian tradition, to me, teaches us how to continue forward in the world and shoulder the burden with integrity.
I think it's okay. So shouldering the burden with integrity, and also you mentioned like automaticity.
Yes.
And like the reliability. Like, let's say you're in the face of that sort of the Sisyphean ordeal that's the human condition. Like we will suffer. Eventually, we'll not we will suffer. And how do we proceed in the face of all of it? And so this idea of like, if you've arranged your character in a way, there seems to be also something about the reliability of like, if you are like heart governed, that this might be more reliable when facing that kind of challenge, that kind of. So one thing I'm wondering is like, if you can make it such that what you would do. So I guess what I'm wondering is, in terms of like heart directedness, to what degree, how many different ways is this coupled to virtue? So one way that's coming to mind is a coupling of but of integrated value across a lot of different circumstances, and like intuition, and basically your heart keeping the score, literally being a mechanism of credit assignment for the sake of, a mechanism for the sake of coherent credit assignment and action selection, so that you can be that's helping you to be an integrated, successful agent and organism in the world. And that you would want to basically, in order to do this, you want to choose what's important to learn from, and what you're going to do, like the action selection problem is like, I have to choose to do something over others. And so, there's like talk in neuroeconomics of, of the importance of having some sort of way of commensurating among potentially incommensurable forms of value, the requirement of some sort of establishment of a common way of adjudicating among all the different competing alternatives. And so this probably happens in multiple ways. Like this would happen at the level of like neuromodulatory systems like dopamine. This would happen at the level of just like competition of like the effectors of action itself, at like converging on like control of the body, but also in terms of the interoceptive value signal. This across all the circumstances, you're going to get these auto-associative networks of, given a situation, how good and bad was the outcome. But there's a sense in which, what are the circumstances under which, though, that signal is more or less reliable? So if we like ignore that signal for all of our lives, maybe it isn't reliable. And actually you might be like the anxiety loops, or like the types of things you might be discussing earlier. Those might really easily creep in there if like we're not, basically training up our intuition, training up our interoception as a means of giving us another code of knowledge and doing. So I guess one thing I'm wondering in terms of like the different sources of connection between virtue and interoception. So one is of this like integrative character, that there's something about like, if you're able to connect something to a broad range of situations where it can be informed by it, that this could help to basically give you a more reliable and meaningful signal, for a more reliable and meaningful guide, just by virtue of being informed in so many different ways. Another thing I'm wondering in terms of the connection to virtue would be innocence. Like there's like a sense like when you're young, you're just not smart enough to be Machiavellian. And it's wonderful, it's just, be still and know. Like that seems like, I wonder how much of like, let's say that's like one of our earlier guides, like just returning to the innocence of that, whether that's like a very powerful virtue. Like it's, Paul Bloom would suggest, it only goes so far in like his book, like Against Empathy, but maybe it's not, a sufficient guide to moral behavior, but the idea that this could be still, especially if like trained up in a healthy community, that this could be like still a powerful thing of like knowing like other concern, like based on emotional contagion, or with shared interoceptive states with others. There does seem to be an ethics built in just to like emotional contagion. I think Franz de Waal writes about that pretty well, and I think Good Natured, right? Yeah.
No, that's Franz de Waal. I just recently watched them and ordered his book. I haven't ever read his book before, but I just watched a really long discussion with him on the biology of good and evil. And the biology of good and evil was the nature of this conversation I watched. It was like 2 hours long, and Franz de Waal was explaining the behavior of chimpanzees and primates, and how good and evil exists within communities that are prior to human cognition and prior to human consciousness. I found that interesting.
How much of this is just shared interoceptive states, but like you feel pain like I feel pain, and now I'm going to feel some of your pain with you. And we have like and we're, you know, maybe we're not all the way where we want to be, but we're a long way towards a pretty good ethics just already.
Absolutely. I think like you said, the scoreboard of the heart, it feels that way. And how much of it, how critical is it that it's crosstalk is not just a phenomena, but the crux of our being, depending upon if virtue comes in and imbues the heart and the spirit and the consciousness, essentially, to me is what enlivens and turns on the sensory lights, what makes us driven towards doing virtuous tasks. And like you said, you may not be intelligent or cunning enough at a young age to pull off the dark triad type traits. You may not. I mean, and
hope not.
I would hope not. And I would hope that, but yes, in general, you're right. And like it says in the Bible, is that Christ says, you know, to come unto me, you have to turn yourself into a child. To enter the kingdom of heaven, you must become like these little ones. And in my little memoiric account of my last couple of years of life that I've written, written for myself, I document this instance where whenever I was going through this process of trying to figure out, going to these Hindu temples and looking at and trying to figure out the nature of where malevolence originated from, was the intent, because I had gotten out of that situation and was like, holy crap, my whole scientific materialist realist thing does not afford a philosophical framework by which I can integrate the idea of this direct malevolence into my existence. And I have to continue living, and I'm going to encounter this kind of outright malevolence again somewhere. And I need to figure out how my philosophy on life is going to incorporate this whole new idea that I've seemed to have encountered. And I went to this Hindu temple, and I remember walking in there, and it was just like this huge odd moment for me, because I'd been away from religion for so long, and going into a Hindu temple of any places was really wild to me. But I read the Bhagavad Gita there and realized, holy, like, these people know about consciousness. They have been writing about it for a long time, and they know about psychedelics too. And I had been going through that. So I went in there with a lot of humble spirit and wanted to ask them. And I walked in there, and I saw this little girl there, and she was standing there. And I remember looking at her and just being like, oh, wow, she's way more spiritually informed than me. But I could just feel it, like in my heart, I looked in her eyes and everything. I was like, wow, I need to bring myself down a lot. I need to kill the ego that needs to die completely, because this person, you could just tell the radiance and the teachings that her parents probably had instilled into her, whatever it was, she knew there was something more to the world, and you could tell it radiated from these children in that temple. And I just remember thinking in my head, like, yeah, you need to make yourself like a child, mentally, physically, just in a way where you can learn something from it, like the beginner's mind, where everybody has something potentially to teach you. In the Zen tradition, it doesn't matter if you have all these prejudgments about a person, even if they're really like an evil person. It doesn't mean that in a 5-minute discourse with them, you can't take one small thing from that discourse that you could learn something from, and just making yourself more elementary in the way you view yourself versus the world.
And that receptivity to, like, not like closing off possibility to what that person could be. You don't know.
You have no idea. Yeah, you have no idea. Nobody knows their heart, like we were saying. And yeah, the automaticity thing, the person I was telling you, it was talking on the idea of a lot, is that as you do practice, the Bible's not this ancient law-giving text, and it becomes less and less of that, because as you follow it and as you practice it, in his view, is that you instill virtue. And like I said, the virtue becomes an automatic way of being, because you start aligning with the teachings of the Bible. Then you're not so focused on following the teachings. You start to follow them out of necessity, because your being is more aligned. And then that automatic aspect of virtue starts pouring out of you. Or that's the idea, is that as you will the good of other
model.
What's that?
The Confucian model, like
okay, yeah.
So I think the character is like Ren, and it means like humanity, but it's not something like, they have different views. So like there's like a sense in which like it's both something constructed that you grow into, and it's also kind of like a birthright, but it's a birthright that requires a maturation process. So it's sort of like you're sculpting a character such that by the time you're like, as you go on in years, just what's natural to you is virtue. And that's the goal, is to basically make it so that the spontaneous doing is ultimately the thing you want, and that you, as an individual and communities, you try to make that like supportive and conducive, so that like, because I'm, in the face of like the and that makes some sense in terms of like the face of like challenge, like you could like of life. If it's like if you can take your more, so sometimes in cognitive neuroscience they'll distinguish between like you know or in machine learning between like more model-based and model-free control. And model-based, it's more expensive. It tends to be more expensive, more flexible, but it's more limited capacity because of its expense. So it's like something like it's like Kahneman talking about like system 1 and system 2 is sometimes discussed in these terms, where it's like you have like a fast automatic cognition with the system 1. System 2 is like a slow deliberative, but potentially reflexive and flexible. Haidt talks about like the elephant and the rider. So if you can get like or like also I guess back to Plato, like with the horse, the chariot, and the charioteers, you have like the noble horse, the horse that goes where you want, and the horse that doesn't. So it's like if you can get those horses trained up right, if you can get the elephant to work with you, that's a good situation. And the elephant seems to be like listening very strongly to the heart. The horses seem to be like,
yeah. Good point. I like that. Yeah, and in the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedic text, they have the same analogy painted there, where Krishna is talking to Arjuna, his young devotee. They have the same. That's interesting. You mentioned the chariot in that format, because they have this idea. At least when I read the text, it's like there's a charioteer and he's holding the reins, and the reins are the mind. Is how this is how this illustrated kind of. The charioteer is the ego, or the lower self, or the higher self, I suppose, maybe the higher self, and it's holding the reins, and the reins represent the mind, and the reins are holding the horses, which represent the senses, and then consciousness, or the higher self, is sitting in the chariot up above that. So maybe the intellect is holding the mind's holding the senses, and the higher self sits above and observes the actions of these, of the combinatory. How does that work?
I wonder actually whether some people would denigrate these models of mind. I personally actually, and they say like it would be naive to say that like the architectural principles of like brain and mind would look at all like any of those, especially those intuitions. I think that's wrong. I actually think that the ancients, they were introspecting a lot, and they were in a lot of ways more in touch with the vital signals that were driving dynamics, the largely interoceptive signals potentially. And that a lot of the way it seems might be shocking to people who knew how to look well and carefully, might actually reveal a lot of the architectural principles. And so a lot of what you described, I'm thinking of a hierarchical control architecture for an embodied agent embedded in an environment within which it's pursuing goals, where as you move up this control hierarchy, you have access to increasingly complex and sophisticated processes, which can help to bring order to lower processes within which they are functioning overall as a integrated system, where you're getting various synergies. So for instance, like, like you can think of like the senses and like system 1, or more model free. It's not really model free, but this idea of like a lot of fast feedback loops and reaction tendencies from the body being a lot of what's just kind of carrying us through the world. And so like there's like these models of the cerebellar system. Oh, by the way, I think we might be frozen. We're frozen. I'll hold on a second. You're back.
Yeah, I was able to hear you the whole time. I just couldn't see you, so I was listening. I got all the way up to the cerebellum. The last cerebellum. You're talking about the cerebellum and the cerebellar system. I was able to hear all the way up until that part.
So cerebellar system. Basically, so Carl will discuss this sometimes in terms of amortized inference, or it's like the cerebellar system. Matt Schein has like very detailed workings, but it's basically you're learning a lot of these parallel they're called forward models of action that you're using that are basically softly assembled, and that basically a lot of your embeddedness, intelligent embeddedness in the world is just this coordination among these different softly assembled, like more reflex arcs, more model free. And you're just sort of moving through the world, being carried along skillfully without requiring a lot of conscious control. And so this would be, in terms of like the brain as control hierarchy, this would be more closer to the modalities that the loops would involve. It would be more of a sensory character. And you would not need access to more of these like centralized integrative things like the brain's rich club, which could support certain types of like workspace dynamics and certain types of like mental actions that would be of more of like a reflexive variety. No need for that. It's just a lot of it is just, and so you're basically pushing this intelligence closer modalities, training up the elephant for good and bad based on everything you think, say, and do. Whatever works, that's gonna, and what works will to some degree be a function of that connection to the heart in terms of what's learned. And so then, and so I don't know. It's, and this idea that the control system, though, our conscious sense of selves, would be of an embodied variety, that what's letting us to kind of turn on a dime is representing ourselves in our particular embedding in the world. As a particular extent, I have a particular geometry. My eyes are here, the world comes in here. It would be Cartesian. It would be shocking if we didn't have like those sorts of like intuitions. And maybe even representational processing brain, they could even have some of that structure, because actually there's some evidence from machine learning that actually you get vastly greater efficiency when you take a neural network and you give it a similar form of its dynamics and that which it's controlling. If it's like, you get like orders of magnitude. So like people like DeepMind, they're trying to use this to control like fusion and like plasma reactors. Like for some processes, it's like a billion-fold. We don't need that though. It's just the idea that there could be something that looks like folk intuitions. And then this actually might be closer to the mark than some of what we think in cognitive science are the best models. I would not be surprised if that's the case. And I've been actually advocating that our folk intuitions actually might be surprisingly apt, surprisingly accurate.
That's a good point, because first of all of what you said is very interesting, to bring that into a neural dynamic of like you're talking about the cerebellum and the system. It's really neat to have this traditional understanding that I kind of have, that I've gleaned from spiritual understanding through these books, but to have somebody like yourself really take that and do what you just did with science and language, combining those two, to combine it with that, it's neat. Just wanted to say that, but I think that it's interesting looking at
respecting though, like the spiritual intuition. Like I view, like, I feel that as being like one of our most valuable data sources is the aggregated into like introspections of all those observations and conversations that happen. Like I'm not like science comes in and this is what's up. It's kind of like, it's, we only have limited access on like this elephant we're feeling on. And then another point is like basically contemplative traditions and tradition. Like I think
absolutely. Yeah, like the idea of Thomas Aquinas, you had sent me that, which I really enjoyed, that panpsychism podcast, or panpsych. I can't talk to it. Yeah, really cool. Yeah, dude, that was super. I really enjoyed that. I listened to it. I finished the entirety of it, but they talked about Thomas Aquinas and Thomistic philosophy. It's so unique because Thomistic philosophy includes he wrote the Summa Theologiae, which is a long, like 4,000 page philosophical dissertation, and Thomas Aquinas is known as one of the most intellectual people of the Middle Ages. And the way he presents Thomistic philosophy, his philosophy on being, is he presents objections first. So it starts off with, is there a God? Does there need to be a God? Is there a reason for philosophy? Is philosophy the best science? Do we need another science besides philosophy? And he goes through that, this whole book. But at some point in there, that's what he says is, hold on, I was going somewhere with this point. It was, he was saying that there's some knowledge that has to be handed down through divine inspiration or divine revelation, because there's knowledge about being, which about being is the only thing that we can understand, and reason can't understand anything beyond reason. But there has to be, that there feels as if there has to be this imbuement into society at some point throughout human history that would be revelatory, that would be something that comes from deep introspection that you can't get without it. And so, like you're saying, pairing that introspection and the spiritual traditions, I mean, you can't really science your way into some of those revelations. Those revelations may, in fact, be from God, if you believe in a God. But I'm saying it makes to me that I would hope that, and I'm glad to know that there's respect being given to those traditions, because I believe that there's a creator, and I know people don't. Some people may not. So I guess it falls down there if you don't. But I believe that even if you don't, like, wouldn't you think that one of the most incomprehensible things about the universe is that it's comprehensible? I mean, the fact that our mathematics underlies science and that math works is weird. I mean, to me, it's just an odd thing that we can actually comprehend with numbers and language and mathematics, all of this. It's weird that we can comprehend it to begin with. And if it's comprehensible at all, to me, shows there's some uniqueness to this creation, and that there may need to be a use somewhere along the line for revealed knowledge to ancient customs, ancient traditions. But that's what I was saying, is that, yeah, it's interesting. I know I'm glad that, that there's that respect being given to that potential of insight and intuition being something that may have something to reveal. And it's turning out that, maybe that is the case. And I know, like, reading into panpsychism and things, I read Annika Harris's book, which I think is a really good book, but she's almost, and a lot of people are making it like this in vogue type thing that intuitions are wrong and they're all wrong. And I agree that a lot of intuitions may be wrong, but I think it's becoming almost popular to deny intuition out of the sake of denying intuition.
Frankly, there's a little bit of academic snobbery going on that I don't resonate with at all. I don't like, and maybe some gatekeeping. Unlike, it's kind of like what happened with like hemispheric differences. Like, you want to avoid overemphasizing naive views of hemispheric differences. But I think part of what actually bothered people was the somewhat supposedly naive views might have actually been surprisingly on point. It seems like academics oftentimes like to protect their knowledge and their sense of separateness and superiority. And I think that's a little bit of what bothered them, almost like an embarrassment and like a defending turf. And so some ideas like wanting to distance yourself from folk understandings, and it's like, no, we know this. And you don't want to be like those other ones who think of Cartesian theaters, or who think of homunculi, or who think of, these naive folk, or believe in free will or meaning or love, or that nonsense anyways. But something, I think I'm of a faith that I suspect that you would get convergence ultimately between, if you did it right. I'm not of a faith that we could do it well enough, but that basically, if you just worked out like the types of organisms we are, and like the evolutionary game theory, and and the local like game theory of like you as you develop as a person in the world, that you would basically discover something like a transcendental ethic, something that like for beings such as you to be okay, you probably should be configured according to certain kinds of policies for action. You probably should shape yourself in certain ways that I suspect you could basically like rederive a lot of what people would say comes from like a source of like, so you're saying like with Plato, it's like, no, that's just like, it's from the forms. Like even like you didn't learn that was or like this is from God. This is like a moral law given to you. Like this was like breathed into your heart. I suspect that a cold analysis would converge with those other sources, but the question though would be, how quickly would they converge, and how long would we be confused? And would you rely on this for someone just coming into the world trying to find their way through? And so some of like, if you wanted to do like a functionalist account of some religion, so like it seems like Jordan Peterson would point to this in terms of like basically religion as to use a term from Damasio, extended homeostasis. And so also to come back to Damasio, like you need to be configured by intuitions in your choice behavior. So he's shown people where you break the somatic markers. You're not reason. It's not like your cold logic is not adequate. It's actually these like heuristics, these guides are actually what make you ecologically rational. And so so then the idea is like, if you can tune in to a myth system, and the myth system is telling you, and not myths, but a system of like deep meanings of narratives, and that this basically would help you to find, to more quickly find adaptive strategies for being in the world as an individual and with others. And it basically, like religion as game theoretic mechanism design, helping you to more quickly converge on equilibrium. Now, that's like a model, like, and I,
Yeah, no, it's beautifully said. I like it. I really like that. I think it's, I mean, I think that you have to speak it like that. I mean, I know that you're probably, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, you're thinking of it like extracting out some of the deeper thoughts because of how modular it sounds, or how model-like it sounds. But inevitably, I think that has to be done.
I don't want to be overly, like, I don't want to do like, because I think like keeping the way of knowing in its own language gives you access to your own ability to commune with it, and in a way it's its own order of being. It has its own terms governing it as like a causal symbol system.
Correct.
Like but if you try to like analyze it with a different frame, like I think there is like, I personally believe in like the synergies, but I think it's not always like you can like, take off your sandals before you approach the burning bush also. Like,
yeah, no, you're right. But I think that the way you're presenting it though, with that extended homeostasis, with that idea, is the way that, and it has to be done like that. Because as being, you know, a Christian believer myself, or whatever believer you may be, it's not my intent to like proselytize or like decide, like bring all these people to Christianity. That would be a good thing, in my opinion. That's part of what you're tasked with as signing up for this. But my task has been to do it like what you just did, where you're taking this religious and you're breaking it down into that kind of language. Well, there's some people like myself before who would have gotten to these ideas of these virtuous truths that I believe to be true without having to go through that breakdown. Like, I had to take it from my scientific, logical, left brain thing to how do I get the corpus callosum firing here? How do I get both sides talking to each other, to where creativity, narrative, archetypes, and subjectivity and all that merging with logic? Well, I needed to bring them both together. And I think like the idea that you just presented with that model of extended homeostasis that Damasio iterates, it's like to get people sometimes to these other insightful, deeper truths, or maybe to even believe that they could exist, would require them to understand it like that first. It's like a step to that. And if that's what they need, or if anything, if it's homeostatic, extended homeostatic desires being satisfied to prioritize self, I obviously still think that's too self-oriented, that myself needs to survive. So I need to know, because I don't really need to survive. I don't need to be, but it's ideal evolutionarily to frame it that way, to show that these truths can be arrived at through that manner, I think. Anyways.
I personally like, for like the ability to be open to different ways of knowing, including ones that I may not fully understand, and to have that like openness. Like, I mean, sometimes, like acts of trust, leaps of faith are needed, but like if I could, the smallest I could make the leaps of faith, I'll take the leaps. But like, I like having as many like bridging principles as I can to like,
yeah, as little miracles as possible. As I was talking to Dr. Donald Hoffman on my last podcast, and we talked for a while, a couple hours. But it was funny because that's what I was telling him. I was like, I know you try to limit your miracles to as little as possible, and you have two assumptions. And he's like, those are my two miracles. I give you two miracles.
Principle of minimal miracle. That's like, yeah. But yeah, I'll take all the miracles like that, but like I would prefer to expect the fewest. Something in the back of my head, could be a conversation for another time, but also I think related to I think also the heart and things like transcendental ethics. So some of these notions of like heart-mind connection are connected to other ideas of self-organized criticality. And so this idea of basically systems poise, and which has also relation to this autocatalysis, that's Kaufman, I think, called The Edge of Chaos. But this, so I think Peter Bach, I forget what it was, like around 83, based on like looking at sand piles and avalanches, came up with this model of a lot of interesting systems have attractor, and maybe ultimately he ended up saying that almost all interesting systems have attractors that place them near what would phase transitions of moving from one regime to another. And so this is sometimes like discussed in terms of like an edge of chaos, where like you cannot predict what's going to happen because you could bifurcate this way or that way or this way or that way. And so this idea of being poised, that your attractors towards an inter-regime, this would make some sense for a complex adaptive system, that you have more of, if you're kind of towards the center of the phase space diagram, you have more of it available to you. Like I can do a trajectory to here, to here. I'm like, you know, if I'm like way the heck over here, it might be hard to like find my way to somewhere else. But if I'm like, I return to this other state. There's another idea though of, in this balance of order and disorder, it might be the one regime in which evolution / learning is possible. So it's, you need enough structure, you need enough variability and playfulness and exploration to discover the new, but then you need enough stability that those discoveries can build. And so so to actually have adaptation and coherent building, evolution or learning, you actually need to be self-organized critical, because otherwise you're missing the components of natural selection.
Okay. Yeah, like scaffolding. You need a scaffolding by which to traverse these things, but also enough creativity to branch out there, you know, take a leap of faith here and there. What was it you said at the beginning? That was called, what was the name of that school?
Self-organized criticality. And
okay.
it must be connected to this idea, I believe, from Kaufman. So Peter Bach, self-organized criticality. And then Kaufman's connected sometimes to his idea of the edge of chaos.
Okay.
And so,
interesting.
And so like with Wolfram's idea, this would be like, you know, you would get like certain, like the interesting cellular automata would like emerge around there. The ones where it's like, you're not just like having like, you know, snow or, you know, maximal entropy snow or like simple oscillations or fixation, but like more fractal, like it'll end up looking like the statistics of nature. And so, but the reason I'm bringing this back is that heart dynamics, see, I'm wondering the extent to which basically self-organized criticality is a multi-scale account of what every complex adaptive system, not necessarily throughout on every level, like you might want some like highly stable sub-elements, but that the system as a whole needs to be near this edge of chaos, needs to have this balanced order and disorder, this balanced integration, differentiation. And what I'm wondering actually, so I'm wondering if basically the heart is a conduit to basically attaining a kind of like overall critical organization, and that's part of the meaning of heart rate variability. And one of the questions I'm having I would ask of you is, in exploring these different spiritual traditions, anything you find that's like that resonates with these, like with that notion, I'd be very interested in, because it seems like it should show up in ancient wisdom, but I'm not familiar with like it showing up. So like basically for me, this is like the Tao. This is like my This is like
the Tao. Yeah, that idea of order and chaos. The idea is kind of parallel to me, at least, kind of between the idea of good and evil. I mean, I know that's a rudimentary way of looking at it, but it's almost like that's kind of what it reminds me of music too. It's like if you have a band playing and there's a guitar solo, and the soloist is playing, and it's almost like he's tap dancing right on the line of order and chaos to get the most connection to his audience. Like a guitarist, when he's soloing, it's kind of offbeat, you know, every other instrument stops, and could be 5 minutes of this wild, just random thing in the middle of this melodic order. But yet that's what brings everybody in the audience and the crowd into this idea where the solo, everybody stops talking. The whole thing that was melodic, everything has turned potentially chaotic. But it's also the same exact thing that's drawn everybody to this person, to the tuning in to listen to this guitar soloist. But if something went wrong, that would just turn into kind of just it would mess everything up. But for some reason, there's something attractive to the ear, to the eye, and to like collective groups about how close can you get to the edge and still be on the edge without collapsing the entirety of the collective organization of what you're trying to do or something. That's not too spiritual, but there is something about the idea, like, yeah, the yin and the yang, but order and chaos, and there needs to be a little bit of chaos to get more order. That's intriguing to me.
It seems to be actually, that does seem to be like, and it's a sensible mapping, and that, like, you know, order, organisms as organizing systems, and if like we're having this like account of value as having the tree of value as having its roots in life itself, like the preconditions for what lets there be life and light and love in the universe, and that a tree of value has to grow out of there in some sense. Otherwise, we probably like got confused somewhere along the way if it doesn't look. Yeah. So, and then also probably that probably our intuitions around music are probably really useful here in terms of like what harmony is like what like a good melody, and like what allows there to be like beauty. Basically, music is like an intuition to beauty and goodness of a complex dynamical system. And I bet like most of the principles are in music. And so
yeah, that's a good point.
It's interesting, but like, so like order, there's some sort of life as ordering process would, you know, order is the good, disorder is evil. You know, but then
yeah. And why does evil exist?
It's not the order, the greater order, and that's where the complexity gets in there.
Yeah, and that's why I think the connection even deeper, good and evil. And I guess what I was trying to get to analogously was the idea that people ask this question a lot. They ask why, if there's a creator or if there's a benevolent force behind the order of the universe, then how come there exists intentional malevolence that appears obvious in the world? Why would there be childhood suffering? That's a common one that atheists use. Childhood suffering is a visceral way for humans to connect to the evil of the world, that benevolence can exist because there's children out there dying of bone cancer. Of course, do you think that, if anything, I feel for those children? I mean, it's not that people who believe in God just pretend those children don't exist. In fact, the most good that's being done in the world to help those causes comes from religious organizations. And that's a fact. So it's like, you know, but anyways, a lot of times my argument against that is this idea of chaos and order, is that in order to bring about order, in order to even know what order looks like, there has to be disorder. And it's not just the absence of order. It's merely the transfiguration, or I think you used the word annealing when we spoke last, which sticks with me. I've actually thought about it several times, and I was talking to my friend. He was messaging me and said that he had listened to me, you, and Chelsea's conversation, and he was like, wow, that was the most interesting conversation I heard in a long time. And he was my friend from high school, so it was neat to hear from him. And then he was asking me all kinds of neat questions about what we had talked about, and I found that cool. But anyways, I was telling him about this and the idea of annealing, like a crucible, turning up the heat before something can become, well, evil's kind of like that. If there is a creator, I view him as utilizing evil to bring about a greater good. Just like right now, if I look back on the Soviet Union and the horrors of the Gulag labor camps, and I recently finally finished the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and Solzhenitsyn was just a brilliant writer. I mean, every page is like enriched with this description of evil that's so profound that you would question the benevolence of the world. And I did multiple times. But I realized that now we look back on the idea of Stalin and the Soviet Union, there's just so much good that has somehow been transfigured from that whole entire idea of what the Gulag was, the death and the mass. I mean, so to me, it's like chaos brings about greater order, especially in the human condition. If you could take your own chaos, your own disorder, and turn up the heat on it and put it in a crucible and bear the suffering, like we were saying earlier, you take what was handed to you as this chaotic existence that's doomed for chaos, and somehow created something somewhat orderly out of it. That to me is like the yin and the yang. Without the disorder, there's no order, and religion tells you how to walk the fine line between order and disorder in a way that allows you to bring order into others and the collective unity of everyone, I think, kind of deal.
It seems like part of like the encouraging you to be like a child too. Seems like that's part of like a little bit of like a useful, like not disorder, but like a not trying to overly control, letting some freedom in there, like a trust too.
Yes, that's why freedom of the will is important to salvage. I think, especially with centering prayer and things like that, they don't dissolve the self to the notion of no free will, and that's why I found the Christian contemplative tradition exactly because why would if there was no if there was no freedom of will, all the creator would have done was create a bunch of subjects that are subject to his exact desires to worship him and bow down to him. That's a very egotistical creator. That's not how it works, in my opinion. The freedom of the will is what grants you the autonomy to choose to do good. And as you choose that, you're essentially choosing order over chaos. And that intentional choice of the will is that only thing that you have that makes you not a clone of God's subject worshiper. I mean, you're given the freedom of the will to the Lord. I mean, God would want you to choose him, but he also wants subjects that aren't his just slaves. The will is what, when you orient that towards order, I think order begets order at that point, because that's where the automaticity of action comes in, is like, you don't have to follow rules as much anymore because the rules are etched onto the tablet of your heart. And your heart, like we said, the heartfulness and the heartfulness dynamic between the heart and mind probably becomes a big portion of it spiritually and scientifically, is that cognition starts to happen with automaticity and with intuition coming from the tablet of your heart, where these rules are written in the history of man, maybe.
So it's like, let's say we take Job. Like,
yeah,
like he starts out and like you're saying, like, so Yahweh's like, he doesn't want slaves. He wants like he wants to be in like a kind of mutual love relationship. And
yes.
And so then the adversary, is that the
that's it. Yeah.
And he's not at that point like even framed even like as like I mean he's not asking pleasant things. Like, he doesn't seem like a pleasant person to be around, but it's not even like he's like framed even necessarily as like, it's almost like he's still a servant of God though, in the story. Like, he's still like part of the thing. It's like he has a function.
Yeah, well, I agree, and there's a lot of mythos circulating around the story of Job, especially Gnostic texts, where there's these two, but like almost two ethereal forces of good and evil, and they're duking it out, and it's like this dualistic thing. And that's not at all how I see the true Christian. I see true Christianity as monistic, and that Satan as an adversary is, like you're saying, he's still subject to the rule of God ultimately. And so he doesn't just walk into heaven and says, "Oh God, can I take Job?" If you see the story, the Yahweh tells Satan that you can do whatever you want to Job, but you can't kill him. Well, why wouldn't Satan just kill him? Because Satan can't. He has no authority. The evil, the adversary, that which is the king of lies, deception, the world, and the selfly pleasures. That's what Satan represents. He was an angel at some point in the history of religion, and he was a fallen angel. I mean, Lucifer means angel of light, a light bringer. Generally, people who deceive you appear as bringers of light. People that I've encountered that were malevolent have tried to present themselves as a bringer of light, as something good, and then I have seen underneath that's how you get the most evil done, is through being a false bearer of light. And so in Job, it's like Satan is still, the adversary is still subject to the rule of God, and God still tells him, you can't kill my servant. And obviously the story of Job looks crazy because he's got, I mean, but he gets everything taken away from him, and he still doesn't. His wife tells him, why don't you just rebuke your God and follow, and then all of his friends are telling him these false philosophies on good and evil, and you must have done something wrong to deserve this. It seems like to be portraying to me that sometimes bad things happen to good people. And we know that, and you have to be able to justify that with a religious belief. And that's what the Bible's trying to do there. Say, look, that's also the longest speech in the Bible by Yahweh. The longest time that God speaks in the Bible is in Job. And he's answering Job's inquiries as to why is there good? Why is there evil? Why is bad things happening to somebody like me who is faithful? The Bible's giving an opportunity there for people to come with these philosophical inquiries that are unsatisfiable and be satisfied through this story without being fully satisfied. You can't know the unknowable, but because God even tells him, he's like, where were you when I did all this work? But he leaves a little bit up to chance, up to non-knowing. But I think you're right that the adversary, as he's painted in Job, is interesting.
Where were you when I was like wrestling with the Leviathan or something? Like, where were you when I separated He's like, what do you? But it's interesting. It's like he with like there's like a collaboration, like a kind of adversarial collaboration, and like they end up like annealing Job so that they can like etch more deeply, like how he appears out of the world like as the whirlwind, and then like really etches it. I'm like, but it's I think like to kind of like bring it to psychedelics. So there's like a sense in which like while I've personally like been somewhat critiquing in an admiring way, like this like rebus account of like relaxed beliefs, there is a sense in which psychedelic states, I think some aspects of them are really well modeled in terms of this annealing, in terms of this like letting go, opening, and then something new can be etched onto you, like putting you in a state where basically the tablets of your heart, things are more readily etched on them. It's just the place I the point I make mechanistically is that like I want a combination of like warming up the tablet and also maybe heating up the pen also. So you're not just relaxing the beliefs in terms of like what's on the tablet, like shaking the Etch a Sketch, but you're actually having a stronger pen. And part of this actually, the 5-HT2A receptors, they're very heavily expressed actually in the anterior insula. And so it's possible actually in terms of like if the heart is, I don't know, the tablet or the pen or both, that there could be an element of greater learning that happens when you increase the gain on 5-HT2A signaling in the face of some sort of challenge, in the face of some sort of stressor.
Oh.
And that, so that could be an interesting connection there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. It's almost thinking, yeah, the kneeling processes and what's represented pictographically and symbolically through these stories in all religious traditions seems to mimic this idea of self-adversary, of self-overcoming, and like you described really eloquently in our last conversation, the idea of this, of what psychedelics do as a model of belief loosening. And you described it very well, and it's hard for me to remember, but exactly what you're just saying here, I believe, what you're talking about, that model, you're critiquing it, but you're also admiring it. It's that model whereby which beliefs are loosened, and the neurology and the neuroscience of it you explained before, but it's that idea of kind of fighting your own beliefs and trying to overcome that kind of dichotomy that exists between self and false self or something of that nature.
False or, yeah, and
ego, I don't know.
More or less deep integrated selfhood, like aligned by values versus selfhood, you know, all sorts of, yeah.
No, I like it. But anyway, so yeah, I really unfortunately I have to head out right in about 10 minutes. But I wanted to I didn't want to cut it cold right there. I was just saying I wanted to really say I really appreciate you joining me again. I hope we can continue this kind of conversational series over the next however long.
I love that. Can I share a confession?
Sure.
So it was interesting, like so like I actually so the problem of evil, like I guess is like when I was young was what broke my faith. Like I could not like find that reconciling. And I'm actually now just thinking about like it's interesting in that the impulse, but what would you need and what would a world look like where you didn't have those sources of pain and accident? It's like, is it the other side of like what you need for like you need the decay for the growth, you need the fertilizer for the growth, like just a kind of like and you need some disorder to discover deeper orders. You need to let yourself be wrong to be right. And I'm wondering if like interestingly actually like I had this view of like divinity as a kind of like neglectful parent / tyrant. But I'm actually wondering whether like there is actually something maybe like proto-tyrannical about this like justice, corrective, impulse, like this sort of like the Luciferian impulse of younger me, actually was, if like that was given free reign, given the wisdom I had at the time, it actually would be a worse world. It actually is not. Anyway, so that's my confession.
No, that's beautiful. I agree. I agree because prior to having experienced the deepest, because thank you for saying that. But yeah, I agree that it's a problem for a lot of people. The number one argument against religious belief in benevolent God creation type argument I can sympathize with is the existence of utter evil. I mean, how could you not sympathize with that argument against a benevolent creator? I mean, you have to entertain it and you're forced to confront it. And to not believe in a benevolent divine creator because of that, I can sympathize with. Because how could you not? I mean, look at the evil that exists. I mean, it's just too obvious. And so I agree with you. And literally, and to my account, to synergize with that is one of, without this deep, what I feel like was a deep encounter with malevolence from my personal experience of life that I had in that intimate relationship that lasted 3 years, and 2 of them way too long, where there was unreasonable abuse just thrown upon me. I mean, and the problem was at the time I had no idea how to escape it. And I know that's typical, like in abusive relationships, but I was like an intellectually minded person. I thought I knew everything there was to know. How could I not have gotten out of that? Looking back on myself, it's like, I can't judge anybody. I know that's a common thing, but I had to strategically plan an escape that could let me out of this without being what I felt like potentially severely hurt. And so I felt like, why? I didn't do anything to this person. I'm overly empathetic that's what caused me to get stuck in it, was to overly empathetic. So I had to have something that collided me with reality so hard that I could integrate my empathy, integrate a sense of self that had respect enough for itself and